Hello, everybody. This is Joseph P. Farrell with news and views from the Nefarium on Thursday, October 14th, 2025. And today I have some really off the end of the twig, nosedive like Wile E. Coyote into the canyon of speculation about the upcoming Putin-Trump summit in Anchorage, Alaska tomorrow. But before we get to that, please remember we do have a vid chat tomorrow evening at 5 p.m. U.S. Central Time. Get your comments and questions in, please, no later than 10 o'clock U.S. Central Time tonight. Remember, one submission per member. And please remember that it's a first-come, first-served basis. We're on that 3-hour time limit. I'll probably be in the chat room, as always, a little early to make sure everything is up and running okay, and just to have a little pre-chat banter with all of you members. Now, I want to talk about the Putin-Russia summit because it's on everybody's lips. We've been watching the media, both lamestream propaganda media and the alternative media, talking endlessly about this summit. And if you were to listen to the alternative media, you would have noted that many of those commentators are rather surprised that the summit is occurring at all, because in their opinion, there's really not that much to talk about. And this, I think, is more or less the standard view. It's a view that, for the most part, I share. Professor John Mearsheimer has been saying this. Professor Jeffrey Sachs has been saying pretty much the same thing. Scott Ritter, Lieutenant Colonel Douglas McGregor. In other words, most of the people that have been commenting on this summit have, in the alternative media, have been expressing more or less the same opinion of it. So we'll call this the normal narrative. And again, it's the narrative that I'm 99.999% in agreement with. We'll get to the other 0.001% in a moment. And that reading is that there's really nothing that Russia can say that it has not already said. And since Russia is in complete control of the military situation in the Ukraine, there's really not much that the West can say either, particularly the United States, since the United States is, number one, largely responsible for fomenting the war, and number two, largely responsible for making sure it continued draining the Ukraine of its manpower and citizenry and infrastructure to fight this crazy proxy war with Russia. So in other words, we have no leverage. Zero, zilch. Sanctions, well, we've seen how the sanction regime has worked in Russia's case because it's only made their economy all that much the stronger. So Russia is in a win-win position. The United States has no leverage, and we're going into a situation where, just according to the news that I was listening to right before I decided to start this news and views, there's already talk that there has been a modified or a tentative or temporary ceasefire agreement, which I assume they are going to make some sort of announcement for before continuing with the second round and bringing in Zelensky and his ilk in Kiev and the nutcase crazies that are leading the Western European powers. But that's the normal narrative. And I wouldn't be surprised if there is some sort of ceasefire announcement. And again, I would not be surprised if Russia says, well, thanks, nice talking to you, and just gets up and leaves the table with nothing accomplished whatsoever. Either way, the normal narrative is we're not going to get anything out of this. Which brings me to that 0.0001%. And I'm advancing this notion simply for the sake of argument, and there is a part of me that thinks there's something else altogether going on here. And part of it may be due to the fact that recently we saw that massive earthquake off the Kamchatka Peninsula, which incidentally also damaged one of the Russian nuclear submarine bases in the northern Pacific. So if we go on the basis that perhaps that may have been the use of a geophysical technology that has been weaponized, perhaps this summit meeting is occurring in that kind of background. But nonetheless, even if that is not the case, I still think that there's that 0.000% chance that something else is going on here. And part of me very much thinks that even though I'm trying to quantize the odds here by giving you percentage bases, I actually think that the possibility of this may be stronger than I'm making it out to be. And the first thing we have to notice about this summit is the selection of the venue. Why Anchorage, Alaska? Well, many people know, few people have commented on the ultimate background for this, but most people know that Russia sold Alaska to the United States in 1867 during the presidency of Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor, and that it was Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State, whom Johnson inherited and kept in that position, William Seward, that made the bargain and the agreement and negotiated with the Russians. And hence the purchase of Alaska ever since that time was known as Seward's Folly. Okay? What most people do not realize is that the purchase was taking place amid the backdrop of the emerging technology of railroads and against the backdrop of the building out of transcontinental railways. In this country, the Transcontinental Railroad at that time was nearing completion. And, of course, several other routes were soon to be added, making that one narrow railroad line ultimately adding several more to it of a transcontinental nature. Canada was building its own version of a transcontinental railroad. And, of course, the big transcontinental railroad project was just beginning in Russia, called the Trans-Siberian. Now, amid that backdrop, there were a number of Americans and Russians who began to think and flirt and propose the idea of a transcontinental, transglobal railroad connecting the Eurasian landmass and North America via the Bering Strait. Russia did feasibility studies of this with American, Russian, and even French engineers. And the governor of Colorado in the United States, Governor Gilpin, actually was one of these people that proposed the idea that this was ultimately the reason for the Alaska purchase from Russia. And then finally, Tsar Nicholas II himself often proposed doing this type of railroad. And just stop and imagine, folks, the geopolitical consequences of what may have happened if such a railroad had been built. It would have given the United States and Russia much more of a common cause and a common financial and geopolitical base of cooperation than we see now. And of course, the danger of that possibility was sensed by the other major player of that era, Great Britain, which of course was dependent upon sea power and whose chief geopolitical theorist, Sir Halford Mackinder, was warning about the ability of railroads and then eventually air travel to integrate the Eurasian landmass in a way that sea power was unable to interdict. And this is precisely what we've seen happening with the Chinese Silk Road projects, with Russia's projects to open up a northern Trans-Siberian and Arctic Trans-Siberian Railway, and so on and so forth. In other words, Britain knew a century ago, over a century ago, that all of these moves on the world stage were a threat to its own hegemony, based as it was on sea power. So what did Britain do? It transferred enormous amounts of its naval technology to the only other country in the region strong enough to interdict that whole project, and that, of course, was Japan. And we saw, as a result of that technology transfer, we saw Japan rise as a naval power and eventually become powerful enough to challenge Russia's domination of Manchuria, which they did. They seized Manchuria from Russia during the Russo-Japanese War early in the 20th century. And, of course, that forced the Russians to rebuild that part of the Trans-Siberian Railway that went through Manchuria. They had to rebuild that whole link to Vladivostok going around Manchuria. So, in other words, the geopolitics of that day was being played out against Seward's folly, the Russian sale of Alaska to the United States, and so on. So, in other words, we're looking at the possibility of a long-range plan that could conceivably have knit the United States and Russia together in common financial interests. It was kind of a northern Silk Road. Now, I suspect that this may be the backdrop for the reason that this summit is occurring at all, and the reason why it's occurring in Alaska. Because it's absolutely vital to the peace and stability of the world for the United States and Russia to at least be talking with each other, regardless of whatever differences they may have over this silly proxy war in the Ukraine. It's absolutely vital. And it's absolutely vital to conduct those talks in a background of, well, let's see where we can cooperate. Let's see where we can do something together that will benefit both of us. So I strongly suspect, lurking in the background, there may be private, very secretive discussions about, well, hey, let's see and talk about reviving this project. Now, if that were the case, and again, this would be a very long-term thing. In other words, this is a summit that's not ultimately limited really to just the Ukraine being on the agenda. I strongly suspect there will be private discussions about some other very long-range projects that this may be the beginning of. We won't know for several years if my speculation here is correct. That's my guess. It will be several years. We might be surprised, and they might come out and just say tomorrow, oh, we decided to appoint a committee, a special committee, to explore the possibilities of building a channel underneath the Bering Strait and a rail link between, Asia and North America. Who knows? I don't know. But let's look at another geopolitical problem, if that's the case. If that is indeed lurking in the background of this summit, then the other thing that it would fulfill is Mr. Trump's previous statements that he's made in his previous administration and also prior to coming into office during this administration, that do we really need NATO? You'll notice that more recently it's the European powers that want to persist in funding and providing weapons to the Ukraine much more than America. And I think Mr. Trump has been trying to find a way out, rather unsuccessfully, because he could easily do it by cutting off all aid, and that's that. But I think the other part here is, if such a summit were to occur, and if all sorts of proposals, reasonable proposals, come out of this summit, and Europe still says no, then this gives Mr. Trump a reason for a much more divisive and decisive break with Europe than we've seen with his tariff policy vis-a-vis Europe and other things. So that's my really high octane speculation nosedive like Wile E. Coyote into the canyon below. I don't think we can entirely dismiss the historical background of the Alaska Purchase and the ultimate railroad geopolitical reasons that underwrote it during the 19th century. It's an idea that has been voiced repeatedly since that time, and it may be lurking in the shadows during this summit. So that's it for today's news and views. Don't forget, please have your comments and questions in by no later than 10 o'clock U.S. Central Time tonight. I will be in the chat tomorrow a little early to make sure everything's working okay. Remember, folks, always check the forum schedule. I'm not anticipating at all any weather problems tomorrow. They are saying we might have an isolated storm or two, but so far they're not saying anything about the possibility of it being severe. If a storm should pop up tomorrow, then I might have to suddenly quit the broadcast, but I'm planning to go ahead with it. As always, I'll probably be starting it a little early. So that's it for today's news and views. Bye-bye, everybody. God bless, and we will see you on the flip side.